Thanks very much. I guess I'm the last thing between you and the bar. Um, I updated the title, but it's the same talk, so don't worry about it. I think I mentioned this on a panel earlier, but I've been working in a museum now for just over a year. It's a totally kind of foreign environment for me. I'm the curator of architecture and digital initiatives at the Guggenheim, which is a new position. I think it's a position that had a lot of ambition but didn't know exactly what it was asking for. And being the first to hold the position, I've had to kind of figure it out as I went and also figure out what it means to actually be in a museum. So I'll start the presentation. I'm going to talk about a single project, the Ozone Futures Market, which is the first ever, as far as we know, online exhibition of the Guggenheim. But first, I think it's kind of important to give a little pretext in the form of kind of amateur organizational psychology. This is a cartoon by Hugh MacLeod that was discovered by Venkatesh Rao. Venkat writes a blog called Ribbon Farm, ribbonfarm.com. He's a few years ago, he came up with what ended up becoming a kind of a cult series of blog posts that basically took this one diagram and unpacked the contemporary organizational psychology of kind of large or medium-sized organizations. And I think it's a kind of really interesting way, for me at least, to kind of move into a museum and try to figure out what the surroundings are like. So he breaks basically the corporate hierarchy down into sociopaths, clueless, and losers. Sociopaths have these characteristics. They do whatever it takes to come out on top. Sociopaths operate according to what they call a heads I win, tails you lose philosophy. They have no organizational loyalty. They move across organizations freely. At the beginning of an organization, they might contribute creativity. Think of kind of entrepreneurs as early sociopaths. Later on, in the kind of middle stages of an organization, they contribute neurotic leadership. And when things start to go to hell, they contribute cold-bloodedness. And basically, they execute decisions that others are too scared or compassionate to complete. So that's sociopaths. Gordon Gekko would be kind of the ultimate sociopath, his motto. Losers, so at the bottom of the pyramid, losers are not kind of like in the, I don't know if this translates to Romania, but it's not someone who's a kind of loser at life. It's much more of somebody who's kind of a loser in the economic calculus of the organization. So they've made a kind of bad economic bargain. They're the ones that do the labor. They do the work. But they're not compensated in the proportion of the value that they create, because of course that goes to the sociopaths. As a result, they have no loyalty to the organization, and they do try to find fulfillment in their work, but coast, meaning basically do as little as possible when they can't find fulfillment. Peter from Office Space is maybe the ultimate example of the organizational loser. An exchange with his boss where his boss said, "Peter, you've been missing a lot of work lately." Peter's response was, "Well, I wouldn't say I've been missing it." Finally, the clueless. Clueless exhibit a perverse loyalty to the organization, even though the organization is not loyal to them. They lack the competence to circulate freely through the organizational economy. They're good at telling other people what to do, but not very good at doing anything. And they have diluted, idealized notions of the organization, and they hang on as long as possible to their jobs. David Brent, the office manager from the British BBC series The Office, is the ultimate kind of clueless middle manager. The best quote I could find from him was, "Does a struggling salesman start turning up on a bicycle? No, he turns up in a newer car. Perception, yeah? They got to trust me. I'm taking these guys into battle." These are the people that think they're really kind of leading the charge. But what's interesting, according to Venkat's analysis, is they're not. It's the sociopaths. The sociopaths are the only ones that are able to speak power talk. Power talk is what allows you to change the kind of direction of an organization. The clueless speak posture talk, which is a type of speech that basically says, with a puffed out chest, this is what should be done, but really nobody's listening. Even the losers speak baby talk back to the clueless, saying, "Yeah, of course you're the best." But nobody really listens. Another kind of insight from this pyramid is the idea that organizations start to die as soon as the clueless kind of layer starts to take over the other layers. So cluelessness is kind of the potential heat death of contemporary organizations. The kind of tragedy about doing this analysis was recognizing that possibly C stands for curator in the museum context. And actually, if I go back a few slides and you think about it through the lens of curators, you could say, are perversely loyal to the organization, even though the organization is not loyal to them. They lack the competence to circulate freely through the organizational economy. What do curators really know how to do? Curators have diluted, idealized notions of the organization. They have to think their organizations are great, otherwise they themselves wouldn't be so great. And as we spoke about earlier, think of them as tenured faculty. Them, us, I suppose. So kind of continuing to dive deeper into this triangle, I think it's pretty easy to say the sociopaths you could actually kind of replace with the people in museums that have access to money. The board, the director, people that actually bring in the money that makes things happen. The losers have the kind of motive force to create things. They know how to paint walls. They know how to hang paintings. They know how to turn on the security system so that museums can actually function. So curators kind of sit in the middle as the kind of front door to the artists that come in and are kind of insulated both from the money and from the interface with the public. So the curator-centric museum is really a kind of waterfall model where everything is kind of moving from left to right and top to bottom. Curators also prize their kind of intellectual autonomy. So you're not supposed to be able to go to a museum and give money and have a curator do an exhibition. Also, curators like to hand down orders. Curators have the kind of keys to the connoisseurship. Curators know what art is saying, and so as a result, curators can tell everybody else how they should do their job in interpreting that message. So the kind of curatorial-centric model is what I would call a money-in, enlightenment-out system. It's very good at converting money to ideas, and those ideas, which could be artworks or objects or performances or whatnot, they then convert through the apparatus of the museum into enlightenment. People see the world in a different way when they go through museums. The problem with digital, though, is that it turns all of those arrows into bidirectional things. So all of a sudden, everything that curators thought museums were, and junk space is the residue mankind leaves on the planet. The built product of modernization is not modern architecture, but junk space. Junk space is what remains after modernization has run its course, or more precisely, what coagulates while modernization is in progress. It's fallout. Modernization had a rational program to share the blessings of science universally. Junk space is its apotheosis, or meltdown. So the big idea that I've been working on with my team is to kind of flip this and to ask the question of what could junk time be. By junk time, we mean the kind of temporal, time-based kind of equivalent to junk space. So if junk space is the kind of detritus of modernization, junk time is the kind of the harrowing detritus of digitization. Junk time is the speed at which you communicate with your artificial intelligence bot through Facebook Messenger. Junk time is the kind of gearing of your body to the rhythms of the kind of digital world, which operates not according to a kind of calendar that we're used to, but from kind of one tick to the next, from one CPU cycle to the next, and a kind of asynchronous kind of stack of interruptions. Junk time is when machines take control. This is mode 1 approach. This is now how Air Force fighter pilots fly. They don't take off or land. In fact, they have to show that their hands aren't even on the wheel to be allowed to land because machines are so much better at it. Junk time is the time of self-driving cars. Junk time is the time of drones that watch construction workers to make sure that they are doing their job. Junk time is the speed at which 13-year-old girls use Snapchat in the park. Junk time is when you introduce things like Amazon Echo or Jibo into your house and it turns everything into a targeting session. Junk time is the type of time that we're teaching our children by putting them into direct contact with these types of rhythms, the rhythms of mechanics, the rhythms of this world rather than the natural world that we had only a few decades ago. So what are the effects of junk time then? I think kind of the curatorial practice I'm interested in is one that's really about mining effects and presenting them for a public audience. So one of the effects of junk time, I think, is junk think. Junk think leads to things like the potential of a President Trump. I think the political system actually in the US and in parts of Europe really represent part of the kind of fallout of junk time, the idea that you can have robotic candidates that are actually not moving according to absolute values, but moving and changing their position at the speed of tweets and other updates. All of the French accents here, I thought I would throw in a French reference at the same time. But junk time also liberates Promethean thinking. Promethean from Prometheus, the Greek mythology of the god who stole fire from the gods and brought it to the humans. Promethean thinking is really the thinking that there is kind of no limit to what we can do. Promethean thinking is evidenced in things like companies that are now being set up to use Elon Musk's rockets to mine asteroids for minerals like platinum and water. Promethean thinking brings us things like brain-controlled prosthetics or replacement arms that are grown in petri dishes. It brings 3D printed nanofish that operate as personalized medicine that go inside your body and chase out toxins. Or even the idea that the Prometheans, most of them are from California, could actually invent an entirely better society. So seasteading is an idea of the kind of ultimate exit, creating these floating communities 200 miles offshore in international waters and creating whole new kind of governmental systems based on things like GitHub protocols. Or even the idea that we can outrun the common task of staying alive. The motto of junk time comes, I think, most from Marc Andreessen, the founder of Netscape and one of the most important venture capitalists, this idea that software is eating the world. Junk time is the product of acceleration. We're now 40, almost say 50 years into the effects of Moore's Law. Moore's Law, the kind of doubling of the capacity of processing and storage and other kind of metrics of computing in regular time cycles. So at the beginning, you have very slow progress. Now we've ended up on what Doug Copeland, I think, very insightfully calls the vertical asymptote. Well, I'll read. We all now live on the vertical asymptote of technological history. Every day, new God only knows how many powerful and transformative technologies are being dumped into the world. New inventions that simultaneously complicate and flatten our lives, and we're all just barely managing to hold on as it is. I think this is a kind of illustration of the effects of living in the speed of junk time. Junk time abstracts. I'm about to get to the project. I think evidence of junk time is really kind of abound and maybe comes almost originally from finance. This is a chart of a kind of nanosecond of trades in high-frequency trading. So high-frequency trading, since the last 5 or 7 or so years, exchanges, particularly in the United States for trading stocks now, actually operate not by human beings buying and selling pieces of company, but by computers in kind of algorithmic wars of kind of nanosecond precision that have nothing to do with the underlying asset. So you're not buying a share of Microsoft because Microsoft has great products. You're gaming a system against a whole bunch of other computers at speeds that humans can't even begin to contemplate. I think something that's even more contemplatable about what's happening in financial markets is the idea or the strategy of quantitative easing that American and British and other governments or central banks have done since the kind of great financial crisis of 2007, 2008, where this is showing the amount of money that's been in circulation or printed by the US government starting in 1914, leading up, bending around the kind of ending of the Bretton Woods Agreement, to the point where in 2007 there was just under $1 trillion of American dollars in circulation. In the course of less than 10 years, they printed 3 times that. So there's $3 trillion now more in circulation in the United States, and almost all of that gets dumped into the stock market. So the stock market becomes an increasingly more kind of abstract space. The other kind of major input, so financialization is one major input into the project I'm about to show. The other is the kind of Bitcoin ecosystem. So I think Bitcoin is the kind of digital currency version of what I'm calling junk time. Ethereum, does anybody know Ethereum? Yeah. So Ethereum is a kind of a new blockchain. So the blockchain was a technology developed by Bitcoin, which basically has its own kind of time stamping. It's basically a kind of distributed database that many people have on their computers, and it basically says how much money everybody has. And because everybody has a copy of it, it's almost impossible to cheat. What these guys realized was you could build a programming language on top of that, so you could actually start to write code. As soon as you have that, you have a system whereby you have economics, you have a currency, and you have the potential for writing law, politics, basically. So you have now a kind of stateless kind of state that I'm having trouble describing and would take a long time to kind of introduce to an unordained audience. But these guys are creating things that may become the kind of next platform, another platform similar to the internet. So all of that is kind of the funnel into the project, and it's multiplied by this, my belief, which is that museums are machines for creating meaning. If they really are about kind of creating enlightenment, that enlightenment comes through understanding and through meaning. And so the little projects, if the big idea was junk time, one of the little projects of junk time was this project about creating situational awareness for operating in junk time. It's a little bit of a megalomaniacal project. It started with a boat trip where I siphoned a little bit of programming money off of a project we were doing in Helsinki. There was a boat trip in 1933 on this boat between Paris and Marseille with 400 of the kind of most important modern architects, where they came up with really the kind of core thesis of what modern architectural thinking was. 30 years later, there was a kind of copycat conference that moved around the Greek islands, the Delos Symposium. You can see Buckminster Fuller here, Marshall McLuhan is somewhere out of the frame, Barbara Ward, a number of super interesting thinkers that were kind of making, I think, the most interesting revelations about the forthcoming networked world. And so we wanted to kind of recreate this, looking at the topic of decentralization. And so we took a bunch of people to the Åland Islands, which are these 20,000 islands and skerries in the Baltic Sea just off the coast of Helsinki, where we spent 4 days living in an Airbnb, walking and talking and coming up with a project. And the project had this really highfalutin, heady, kind of nerdy concept of a kind of book full of what we were calling ephemeral theories in the form of speculative vocabularies, meaning realizing that the world was changing so quickly we don't even have a vocabulary to talk about it. And so we wanted to create a kind of compendium of theories or theses about what was happening in that future world and what we might call these things. So I'll just skip this. So we made a book. So one of the concepts that we came up with was the idea of data shaming, which was the idea of rather than shaming Google for using your data, you should shame people who use Google and give their data away for free. And the idea was to wait until these terms came into kind of existence, and if they did, we would unlock the content or our kind of prognostication or prediction of them coming and share it through a website. But then, as we were building this, Grexit was in full throttle last summer, and the Chinese stock market started to go crazy in a way that I think we've never really seen before. And so our kind of ephemeral theory, speculative vocabulary started to seem like a kind of cheap project. And so instead we decided to build something that would be much more interactive, much less kind of us telling you what we think is the future, and much more of a kind of demonstration of how to actually participate in those kind of future economies like Bitcoin and the world of the stock market under quantitative easing. So we created a project that we called the Ozone Futures Market. It's a web project, as I mentioned before. It's the I guess first ever Guggenheim digital or online exhibition. One kind of piece of insider information was that when I told people at the Guggenheim what we were working on, basically they said, okay, that's fine, do your own thing. As soon as I called it an exhibition, I got all kinds of resources and help, and also other opinions, but all of a sudden then it could slot into places like our website. Nobody knew what to do with this before we called it an exhibition, so we did. And the way that it worked was we came up with a group of 36 what we called futures. So think of kind of in a regular stock market, you trade things like pieces of companies. In a futures market, you trade the future price of something, like the future price of oil or the future price of grain or the future price of gold. And what we were doing here was actually trading what people thought were kind of future dreams for human society. So things like algorithmic governance or interplanetary life, or decentralized sustainable energy. There was 36 of them that we sourced from a group of philosophers, technologists, architects, artists, and so on. And they all kind of came from looking at the Gartner technology hype cycle, which is the idea that the beginning you have a kind of new technology, the beginning of any new huge technology, like say the internet or Facebook. At the beginning you have a technology trigger, like the transistor. Then you get the peak of inflated expectation when everybody says, oh my God, this will change everything. And then it doesn't. And so the hype kind of flatlines out into what they call the trough of disillusionment, where people think, well, Facebook will never take off. Then you finally get into the slope of enlightenment when the technology catches up with the promise, and then you end up finally in the plateau of productivity when that technology becomes naturalized into our lives. So we were interested in those technologies that were just coming out of the trough of disillusionment, that were starting to have kind of potentially really profound effects on society. We gave, basically people could come to the site and they could sign up, and we would give them, you create a kind of a user account. And with your user account, we would give you this kind of fake currency that we called coin. You got 10,000 coin, and with your 10,000 coin, you could go around and buy up pieces of stock. Not me. You could go about and buy up pieces of stock in each of these different futures to kind of create a portfolio of things that you thought would actually sort of come to be, but also what you think that other people would think would come to be. So it had this kind of strange feedback loop. With each of them, we worked with a data scientist to come up with a means for creating a kind of running price. So as more and more people bought a particular future, the price would go up and it would go down after if people started to sell it. The way that you bought something, the cost of a transaction, was to apply a piece of information to it, and that came from a URL. So this was, you're reading the New York Times, or you're reading Hacker News, or you're reading some strange fringe blog, and you find out about a new artificial intelligence system that Google is working on. You can use that as what we call the hot tip to say that's why you think algorithmic governance should be worth more, or actually is going to go up, because that new technology is going to create the kind of conditions for this condition to exist in the world. The result was that we ended up creating a kind of data aggregation machine where we had over over 4,000 users at one point feeding in information and trading on this kind of artificial market. And you can trade off of other people's tips as well. So we had leaderboards where people who were making the most money or making the most trades, or a number of different things that we were tracking so people could figure out who was winning and who was losing. We created a kind of series of bespoke interfaces that would visualize the way that the future was tending based on how people were investing in things. We worked with the Center for Architecture in New York to do an installation of a kind of full heads-up display of the market. We invited a number of contributors, artists, architects, and theorists to put together hedge funds where they would create kind of investments in the market based on contemporary worldviews. So we started with these kind of 36 potential futures, but then of course there's a number of people, a number of kind of camps of people, typically bound by the internet, that have certain beliefs about where the future is going, and we wanted to use this as a way to bring those ideas to a broader audience. So you could actually track the, how well the transhumanist idea of the future was going. I think the kind of the press story was kind of really interesting, and I think it was less about people even understanding what we were doing. The more you read the articles that came out about the project, the more it was kind of people didn't totally understand what was going on. In fact, the later articles, the better ones, were journalists who had spent time trying to understand it and then talked about their story of trying to understand it. I think it was much more of, the kind of press coverage was much more, for me, realizing that the Guggenheim press machine is very powerful. And when you do something for the first time, it's very, very, very easy for any kind of journalist, any tech blogger, to quickly kind of drum up a story. But the thing that got me most excited was these two. So this was Nick Land's blog. Nick Land is a kind of strange philosopher, a British guy who's camped out in Shanghai. Really kind of like the guy that has his finger on the pulse of the netherworld of strange internet phenomena, and we made his kind of short list. We also made the front page of The Economist, which for me was ultimate vindication, because it's not typical that a museum exhibition ends up in that kind of media. But we also had a number of hackers. So we had people that these guys set up a Twitter bot that was mining our market for information using the kind of API to create kind of regular tweets that would show people what was happening in the market. This was the activity, mostly the activity on the first 3 days of trading of an artist in Berlin who realized you could set up an unlimited amount of accounts if you just had an unlimited amount of email addresses. And each time you set up an account, you were basically printing money. So it was quantitative easing in practice. So you can see Daniel Keller here, and Daniel Keller bot, and Daniel Keller bot 2, and Daniel Keller bot 3, and so on. These were the top 25 accounts that were transacting on a single future, the decriminalization of drugs. And the result was what he would do was, and he stayed up for 72 hours straight doing this as a human being clicking his mouse. He started by buying the stock at a very low price with his regular account. Then he used all of his bots to buy the stock to push the price up. And once he had finished using his bots, he would sell with his account at the highest price, and then sell with all of his bots driving the price down, and then buy with his account again and do the process over and over. So you get this incredible kind of sawtooth graph, which was also for us was a kind of teachable moment. So we can actually use this as a way in our blog to describe to people what the hell was happening and why they were losing money or why the stock market looked like it was fixed. In fact, it was kind of fixed through this pump and dump strategy. So we had to do new technological fixes like inserting CAPTCHAs. We then invited Venkatesh, actually the guy that came up with the sociopath theory, to give a workshop. I'm just going to skip over this a little bit. We don't need to talk about that. But what I think was also really interesting was these other guys, these artists and technologists in New York, set up their own kind of corporation on the ozone futures market, where they created a business where they did what the pump and dump guy did by hand. They wrote some code to do it kind of automatically and quickly jumped to the top of all of our leaderboards, and they made their username their email or their URL address, and they would have people pay them to put advertising on their URL. And so the thought was that they were actually trading in the cultural capital of the Guggenheim by gaming our system, getting their URL to the top of the system, and then having people pay them to take over their homepage effectively as advertising. So we thought that was cool, and so we invited them to present and to have their annual shareholders meeting at our conference. So that's the last thing. So that's the project. I'm going to stop there. I guess the big question with a project like that is kind of how does it die? And we've thought of a number of things. One was to just kind of push it into the open source ether and allow other people to take it on. But I think where we're kind of ending up now is the idea of creating a digital ruin. We've been working with MetaHaven, who are graphic designers, to create a kind of series of ads that will basically kind of cannibalize the site itself. So in the same way that things like Facebook ultimately monetize by creating ads and effectively strangle themselves, we're going to strangle Ozone with advertising. But I can't show you pictures because it's not launched yet. So anyways, I'll stop there. Thanks very much for your patience.